Very well. All right, but like I say, these might be the tropes that Matthew is familiar with, but how did he actually go about and turn this into an actual story? It's not just a bunch of, and then this, and then this, and then this. It's much more creatively structured. And in particular, the way he's structuring it is going to be a technique. It's a term that's probably come up on MythVision a few times, this term Pesher. And it's well known in studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular. And it's this strategy of trying to take the Old Testament and use a strategy of looking and comparing different parts and figuring out ways of putting it together to get new modern insights. So the old context doesn't matter so much. By doing this almost Bible code sort of thing, we can get new information. But it's a little bit different than like the Bible code that's like, shown like on the History Channel, where it's literally just looking at text and trying to find random words to pull out. This is actually a much more strategic method for doing this. It's basically you are going through and you're reading through a text in something called continuous Pesher, and you're basically reading through a text. Maybe it's Isaiah, maybe it's Habakkuk, things like that, and you're going through and like each of the verses or a couple of verses, you're looking at the themes of it or the key words and seeing where that theme or keyword shows up in another text, and then bring those together to interpret them together in that way. So it's not just random grab bag, it's actually much more methodical in that sort of approach. And the things I'm going to try to show about that today is coming from this particular article by James Patrick. It's from over a decade ago, and it's basically showing, like, here's the nature of the Pesher technique as we can reconstruct it, and how Matthew seems to use this throughout his gospel. But I'm going to just, again, focus on the nativity portion of it. So I do recommend this full article, but it's basically 2 pages that I'll be focusing on the most when it comes to this. And to see how noting the strategy that he's using is going to go from Matthew looks like he's just kind of a fool and just grabbing things that doesn't care about context, versus no, he actually knows and understands the context, and using this technique is how he can actually create a new, interesting theological story. And as this article notes, that most of these Peshers are going to be on Isaiah, and if you're reading the nativity story, there's one quotation from Isaiah that just stands out, and I think you probably know which one that is.
Isaiah 7:14.
Exactly. And so this is how Matthew renders that verse. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. Now, again, I don't want to step on the toes of what Bart probably said last night, but it's an extremely well-known thing that there are problems with the way Matthew has read this. The original Hebrew doesn't necessarily justify that this woman is a virgin. The tenses doesn't suggest this is something that a conception is going to happen in the future. Lots and lots and lots of things. And of course, in the original context of Isaiah, this is about not some woman 800 years in the future. It was basically a woman that was probably in the same room Isaiah was in when he was describing his prophecy to the king. It's clear that Matthew is taking his story and divorcing it from that original context. And of course, by taking the Greek version rather than the Hebrew, and this quote-unquote mistranslation of the word Alma instead of treating it as Betula and turning it into Parthenos. Like I say, a lot of this is probably well known to the audience, and it would suggest that, okay, Matthew doesn't even know or care or understand what the original context was. I'm going to contend that actually Matthew does know this context, and he is using it to actually craft his story. So if we actually go to the general context of who is this child in Isaiah 7, and what's the greater theme of what's going on in there. So this child is supposed to be of the Davidic line. This seems to be indicated in multiple places in Isaiah, including the verse just before the quote-unquote virgin birth prophecy. And this king that Isaiah is predicting, this child who will become king, is being contrasted with other kings, and this will be important. And the general theme that you see over and over again here is the return from exile, in particular the Israelites who are no longer basically part of the greater kingdom. They're like, not part of the kingdom of Solomon that's divided off. They're now with Assyria, the Israelites in the north. But the prophecy is that they will come out of exile, they will all come together, and all these great things will happen, including the destruction of those evil kings, while the child being prophesied is still young. So key things here are exile, the reconciliation and coming together of God's people, and this will all happen while the child is still young, and the evil kings will be destroyed as the new Davidic king basically comes into himself. So far, so good?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So this is the general context. Do we see Matthew showing awareness and use of this? So first off, let's go to the most boring part of the whole story, the genealogy. Just, this list of names of who begat whom. And I have to admit, when I first was trying to get into biblical studies, open up Genesis, I get to the begats, I snore, and it took me years to try again to actually understand the Bible. That was a great way to make sure I never learned anything. But if we go to the genealogy, as been noted by Matthew himself, Jesus' genealogy consists of 3 sets of 14 ancestors. He particularly highlights this. And why the number 14? As been noted, if you look at the name David in Hebrew, Daud, and add together the letters in the form of gematria, adding together letter values, you get the number 14. So Jesus comes after David, David, David. It's basically screaming how Davidic he is. The other thing, though, to note is how that set of 3 14s is broken up. It goes from Abraham to David obviously being important, David to exile, and then from exile to Jesus. Notice here, it's not counting from David to another ancestor, but to an event. That's an interesting thing that's changing here in how he's highlighting this genealogy. He's going through, he's citing person after person after a person, but he's saying the main dividing thing between the second to last and last set of 14 is the Babylonian exile. And that's, of course, not the Babylonian, but exile more generally is a theme, that theme of return from exile that we see in Isaiah. So Matthew is already choosing to say there is something about the exile that's important here, that Jesus is basically the end of that exile, the combining together of the Jewish people again for their Davidic king.
Really makes a lot of sense what you're saying, especially if you take to account Matthew 10, Matthew 15, when he continuously says, like, I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel to regather the children of Israel. Like, he's, in fact, even in Matthew 1:21, I think it is, where he says he came to save his people from their sins, and his people would be the Jewish people. So he's there to do exactly like you're talking about, bring them back.
Exactly. Though I will also note, there is also a Gentile connection that we will note later, both with the beginning and end of the story, but I can't spoil everything right now.
Cool. Excited.
All right. So thematically, there's an interesting connection between Isaiah 7 and the nativity story in Matthew, but this is hardly the only connection across there. If we continue to go through and look at the verses after the virgin birth prophecy, Isaiah talks about judgment against Ephraim and Judah, but then their final return, their final reconciliation together. So in the strategy of the Pesher technique, if you're reading through and you say, okay, the theme here is return from exile, and it's going to relate to Ephraim. So you're going to say, all right, where else in the Hebrew Bible does it talk about Ephraim and exile or return from exile? Well, if you go to Hosea 11, you actually find just that, where Ephraim is said he's going to be coming out of exile. In particular, you get the statement, out of Israel I have called my son. Mm-hmm. This might sound a little familiar because it's directly cited by Matthew.
Which is fair to say that Matthew knows Hosea. Simple as that, he's reading this text.
Exactly. And in that case, also, if we're looking else for other places, where else is Ephraim talked about returning from exile? And we find that also happening in Jeremiah 31. And in Jeremiah 31, there's also the statement about Rachel looking for her lost children. She's crying because they're lost, but then the promise is that actually they are going to be found in return. But if you are noticing, hey, Jeremiah 31:15, that's also directly quoted by Matthew chapter 2, verse 18. In this case, Rachel's supposed to be crying about the slaughter of the innocents, who are, the babies killed by King Herod. But again, we are seeing, look at the strategy that Matthew is using. If he is using the Pesher technique, Isaiah is talking about Ephraim coming from out of exile. Here are these two passages about Ephraim coming out of exile and being put together to create the narrative. This is now looking much less like just a bunch of random verses that Matthew's getting. He actually has a strategy for choosing these verses.
Even if it is plucking out of the context to create it, he has a mission in mind, is your point. And another thing, we may just call the author Matthew for the sake of convenience. Don't take that to the bank. So, And another thing I want to say is, just because he has Hosea here and he quotes his part, I'm not saying, I don't know whether he has the whole book of Hosea or if he just has sections of it. Doesn't matter to me. We see where he's lifting it from. So at least imagine in the context in this area, he knows. So.
Right. And actually a good call that we keep calling the author Matthew, but yeah, we don't, well, he doesn't say what his name is. I have it on good authority. He likes to be called Marty. No. But like I say, he definitely has a religious goal here, and he is removing these verses from their original context. But his strategy is not random because it's actually following this Jewish interpretive technique that had been going on for at least a century by the time Matthew came along and applied it himself to his gospel story. So that's where I'm saying that these choices are not random. They're not just being plucked out of nowhere. This is actually following strategy of interpretation that was very much in vogue amongst Jewish interpreters of the Hebrew Bible. Matthew's basically saying, I can do that too. Let's see if I can do it even better. And of course, if we're continuing to go through the Isaiah passage, we're going to find also more connections to these sorts of things. So for example, Isaiah 7:13 is specifically talking about the restoration of, to the throne of David, that David is going to, one of his ancestors will be on the throne and basically in charge again after this return from exile out of Assyria. In particular, most of that is connected to Ephraim coming out of Assyria. Well, if we are looking for a ruler to come out, where are we told about a ruler coming out? In particular, a Davidic ruler. In Matthew, we are saying, well, he is born in Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy in Micah 5:2, that out of Bethlehem will come this ruler that will shepherd the people of Israel. And also, if we were looking for more examples of a Davidic person who will come out of exile, and even more specific to exile related to Assyria being listed among the places that the exiles will come out of, we see that later on in Isaiah itself, in Isaiah 11, where it talks about the branch from Jesse that will be part of, that basically will rise up and bring the people out of exile. That word branch in Hebrew is netzer, and based on this Pesher technique, it seems to me that this might be the most likely cause of where Matthew is saying he's getting this prophecy that, it says in the Bible that the Messiah, he will be a Nazarene. It's been very hard to find where he's actually getting this, and my suggestion is, based on using this technique and the word choice here, it's probably the best case that the he will be a Nazarene prophecy comes from Isaiah 11:1. The Netzer from Jesse, the Nazarene from Jesse, in that sort of transliteration.